It only took my mother 2 weeks to go ahead and get remarried after my father passed away. Well, the guy that she married had 3 other kids, and long story short, he didn't like me. I get kicked out of my house, and you know what? I start to find out a lot of secrets about this creep. Well, I'll get to that later. This main story is about me and my mother's relationship, and guys, I'm about to tell you right now exactly what went wrong over the course of a few years and how our relationship went so wrong. I've never had an ordinary, happy, loving family relationship. From the moment I was born, my father would say things like, "You should have never been born." My mother would constantly tell me about her problems and confide in me as I could solve all her troubles or something like that. I would get scolded for the smallest reasons at home, and whenever my father was indeed angry, he would attempt to beat me, although there were times when my mother would protect me. Sometimes I would get beaten just because of her. I would work very hard to prove to my family, but my father never wanted to see me. That's probably why I've really never had a birthday celebration or even received any gift. My clothes would be hand-me-downs from my mother or relatives, and after school I would lock myself in my room, sometimes walking for a long time just to avoid going home. Looking back now, when I was little, I used to write letters to my mother, expressing my desire to die and how unhappy I was. In fact, they were hopeful letters from a 5 or 6-year-old girl because I would always place the letters where my mother could find them. But she never read them. My mother had a friend named Eric, and she kept it a secret from my father, and when I first met Eric, he treated me well. Back then I would think, I wish I had a father like Eric. Eric would take my mother and me out to buy us gifts. My mother would often talk about Eric and how everything would be fine one day. I didn't know how that would happen, but I hoped it would, and I wanted to leave home. I could not stand feeling exhausted and worn out from life. I wanted to have a life of my own. Some nights were filled with tears for me. The school had gone on break, and I had secretly started working to save money for my family. Towards the end of the summer, my father died in a work accident at the factory. I wasn't actually sad. I pretended to be because I was afraid people would hate me or thought I didn't have emotions. How could I be sad when I no longer needed to be afraid and my mother would be happy and love me more? But I was mistaken. My mother and I had a fight on the night of the funeral, and she asked me, "Are you happy?" She started yelling at me, saying that I was the reason she was alone and that I was nothing more than ungrateful. She blamed everything on me, and I just felt terrible, as if everything was happening because of me. I begged my mother not to leave me, just to love me. I had no pride or dignity. All I wanted was to be loved. I quit school and started working more, giving her half of my earnings to my mom and saving the rest, but what I did not realize was that my mother married Uncle Eric. After blaming me for everything, she decided to marry Eric, and she didn't even inform me. At first, the marriage surprised me quite a lot. They didn't bother asking me or even acknowledging my presence at all. It seemed as if my mother simply just did not want me to be, well, with me, and quickly escaped into somebody else's arms. But since I had met Uncle Eric before, I had a glimmer of hope. Maybe I could finally have some sort of a normal life. After all, Uncle Eric was the first person who treated me well and simply took care of me. I overheard my mother talking to Eric. She said I needed to work harder, implying that I was living off them for absolutely free. Once again, I had been mistaken. Months went by, and Eric's children started living with us, and all the money I earned and all the energy I spent went to Eric, and worst of all, to his children. The children looked down on me, and Eric ignored me. Despite my mother knowing everything, she did not speak up or defend me. Eric started exploiting both my mother and me for all of our money, and one day, when I finished work, I saw Eric with another woman. I was shocked, and when I followed him, I could not believe my eyes. When I saw them enter a hotel, he had not only taken away all my efforts, but also cheated on my mother. First, I went back home and told my mother everything. However, she slapped me and accused me of unjustly blaming Eric, saying I was acting spoiled and I just wondered where I was going wrong. Why did she not believe me? I begged her to believe me, but she continued to get angry at me, and as a result of these arguments, my mother demanded that I apologize to Eric. Hearing that really hurt me deeply, and that night Eric came home and the whole family gathered in the living room. My mother explained everything to Eric, and Eric responded with laughter and mockery. I didn't know what to do. My mother had asked me to apologize in front of everyone, and I truly did not want to. I became very angry that night, refused to apologize, and told my mother that she was continuing to believe Eric's lies like a fool. I gathered all my belongings and I left. With the little money I'd saved, I went to a hotel. I started thinking about what to do next, and then I remembered that Eric never mentioned anything about his ex-wife, and I wanted to seek revenge and see them suffer as much as I did. Initially, when we first met, Eric mentioned that where he lived and invited me over, but I never had the chance to go. I went there first and asked the neighbors, and I heard things about Eric living with another woman here, not going to work at all, and his ex-wife coming to confront him. At that time, they had not divorced, and there was a big commotion in the neighborhood. Apparently, Eric was cheating on his ex-wife here. When I asked the neighbors where I could find his ex-wife, by chance, a woman who happened to be Susan, Eric's ex-wife's co-worker, told me how I could find her. In reality, my mother always makes poor choices. I feel like such a fool. How did I end up like this? How could I be so foolish and blind? I immediately went to find that woman. Her name was Susan, and at first Susan did not want to see me. She thought I was one of Eric's girlfriends, and I struggled to explain the situation to her, but eventually she agreed to listen to me. When I explained the situation to Susan, she said, "That idiot has been cheating on me for years, and I had no idea. He would manipulate me, constantly taking my money and leaving the house to go somewhere with children while I went to work. I found out he was cheating on me through my coworker." Eric had rented a house with another woman, and they were acting like newlyweds. I would have continued to believe if they had not moved to my coworker's neighborhood, she said. I didn't know what to do after hearing all this. I asked Susan if she could meet my mother and tell her everything, however, she refused. She didn't want to encounter Eric again, and she mentioned that she had been receiving psychological therapy because of him. At the beginning of our conversation, I had obtained permission to record it, and this was my evidence. But then, I asked her if I could meet my mother without Eric present, and she gave me her phone number and agreed. Thanking me for everything, I left Susan and secretly invited my mother to meet at a cafe. I told her that I wanted to apologize to Eric, but first wanted to talk to her. When my mother heard this, she agreed. First, I told my mother that I wanted her to listen to something, and when I played the audio recording, she was absolutely shocked. She accused me of lying again and claimed that the recording was a fake, a phony. Moreover, arrogantly, she told me how she protected me when my deceased father abused me and how I betrayed him. I contacted Susan and took my mother to Susan's office. Even though my mother did not believe me, she would realize the truth when she spoke with Susan. I left them alone in the room. When they came out of the room, my mother had come to realize the truth. Although she initially tried to deny it, she mentioned that Eric had not been staying at home lately and that even when he was at home, they would constantly argue. After I left, he pressured my mother to get a job and even manipulated her. Before I called, my mother had been looking at job listings and my mother apologized to me. But I did not care anymore. All I wanted was for her to love me, and I said to her, "What good does it do for you to apologize now? Did you think it would extinguish the fire inside of me?" You threw away every letter I wrote to you without reading a single one, and you remind me, well, how you were silent when I was beaten, even allowed my father to beat me. And when my stepfather and his children mistreated me, you didn't defend me once. I can't hate you, but I don't love you, Ma." These words hurt my mother deeply, but I had been hurt before, so this time I did not want to console her. My mother told me not to come home for a while and that she would handle everything. Then she left. I'll never trust anyone in my life again, and I'll never love anyone again. A few days later, my mother called me and said that she kicked Eric and his children out of her house and filed a lawsuit against Eric. For the first time, my mother invited me back home. But this time, I did not want to go. I told her she, should not wait for me anymore. What's up, everybody? Mr. Reddito here. Oh man, what a family drama. This one has some crazy parts, but you have seen nothing yet. There's 4 updates. The last update was deep in the comment section, but I have it, don't you worry, and this completes the story. Let's hop into update number 1, but if you guys want to take a second to support the channel, it helps so much and it's absolutely free. Hit that subscribe button underneath this video. Thank you so much for that, and let's jump into the first update. I thought I would have to talk to my mother anymore, but that was not the case. I received a call from the hospital saying that my mother had attempted to harm herself. Immediately, I went to the hospital. Well, thankfully, my mother was still alive. And the doctors told me that my mother needed psychological treatment, but she would never agree to such a thing. I discharged my mother and took her home. She asked me to stay with her for 1 day, so I did. We sat down for dinner and we talked. I could not believe what my mother was saying. She told me that if I ever left home again, she would attempt to hurt herself once more. When I asked her why she did this, she said she did not want to live alone and was afraid of being alone. My mother was always selfish, only thinking about herself. I had no other choice. As time went on, my mother got worse. She would not let me leave the house, and when I did, she would demand that I come back immediately and constantly call me on the phone. I was on the verge of losing my mind. My life was turning into a constant nightmare, and my mother even started locking me inside the house when she went to work. Finally, I could not take it anymore, and we had an argument. She kept saying that everything was my fault, and after she started throwing things at me, I found myself back in the hospital. My mother had lied to the doctors and told them that I had harmed myself, and I was too weak to stop her. When we returned home, I just laid in my room and thought about what I could do, and I had no idea how to solve this situation. I told my mother that I wanted to take a walk for a bit and promised to return at the same time that she wanted. I had no chance of running away because she would attempt, to harm herself. I entered a pharmacy a few streets away. I asked for a sleeping pill. When I returned home, my mother had cooked dinner and was waiting for me at the table, and I sat down at the table, and we started talking and arguing. She was saying all the hurtful things while also apologizing for my hospitalization. I recorded all the conversations as evidence. After closing the topic, I offered her something to drink and gave her a sleeping pill. My mother fell asleep, and I quickly left the house and went to the police station to report her. They told me that I had the right to admit my mother to a psychiatric ward, and they would support me in that. My phone was ringing, and my mother was starting to regain consciousness from the sleeping pill. I quickly entered a supermarket and bought a lot of junk food. Then I returned home. My mother asked where I've been, and I told her that I wanted to snack on something while watching a movie, but I wasn't home because of that. I apologized, saying that I thought I could quickly go and come back without disturbing her since I saw she was asleep. We watched a couple of movies together, and then I went to bed and fell asleep, and that night, I thought long and hard about what to do. I felt trapped as if there was no way out. Update number 2. That night, I had made up my mind. My mother had gone to work again and locked me inside the house, and I had been waiting at home feeling extremely worried. When my mother returned home, I told her that I had prepared dinner for us. As soon as my mother fell asleep, I left the house and went to the hospital. I explained my mother's condition and expressed my desire as her daughter to have her admitted to the hospital. After the doctor read the police report and listened to me, the necessary procedures were initiated. They informed me that they would come tomorrow to take my mother to the hospital, and I went back home. And after a while of my mother being at home, she woke up, came to me, and pleaded for me not to leave her. I was deeply saddened because those were the conversations I used to have, so I promised her that I would not leave her. Perhaps after receiving clinical treatment, we could have a beautiful family. I had hope. But every time I had hope, it turned into a disappointment, and the ambulance arrived to take my mother home. My mother was screaming, throwing things, cursing, and begging for help. I felt terrible. After a week or two of her being in the hospital, I was finally able to see her. She started crying when she saw me, and it was extremely difficult for me to hold back tears. I reassured her that everything would be okay. When I spoke with the doctor, they informed me that there had not been any positive progress and that she had engaged in emotional manipulation. That's why I did not visit her again. A year passed, and my mother was finally discharged. Around that time, I had a boyfriend, and we had been together for 6 months. I decided to introduce my boyfriend to my mother and try to get everything back on track. My mother was discharged, and my relationship was going well. Didn't you think so while reading? It seemed like things were falling into place. During the dinner, when we all met, my mother kept ignoring my boyfriend and only talking to me. She had taken a negative stance towards my boyfriend, and my boyfriend responded positively to the situation and told me that mother needed some time. She understood. But what I started considering was that maybe my mother had not truly recovered. This continued on for a few days, and I finally told her that we need to leave. My mother attacked my boyfriend for leaving, and the same pattern started repeating, and after that incident, my boyfriend left me. And my mother told me that I deserved it, and that I had done the same thing to her. I wish I hadn't shown any kindness to this woman. Update number 3. Hey guys, I need your help, as I felt stuck in this situation, and let me tell you the full story. So after that day, I never saw my mother again. Something terrible happened. I became pregnant with the man who abandoned me. My ex-boyfriend did not care about it and left after saying it had nothing to do with him anymore. I wanted to get rid of the baby, but it was too late. I was terrified of raising a child, and worse, I had fear of becoming like my own mother. It was already 3 months away, and I continued working somehow, but my boss was having problems because of my pregnancy, and I was constantly just experiencing faintness, feeling nauseous at work. After a month, my boss told me I needed to find another job and that I could not continue working like this. I had to make a decision that night after leaving work. My mother kept calling, messaging. Even though we did not meet, I had made up my mind. I told my mother that I was pregnant, and I constantly find myself on this path. When I arrived home, my mother welcomed me with great happiness, and we started talking, and the apologies and pleas for forgiveness began again. Being desperate, I told her that I forgave everything. My mother started to suffocate me with the excessive attention, which made me uncomfortable because whenever I saw her being so good, she would eventually start doing terrible things. For a long time, I only saw her as being good, so I started to think that my mother had come to her senses. A few months before the delivery of my baby, my mother and I argued. The topic was about not wanting to get married one day, and I did not want to raise my child without a father. But my mother was strongly against it. My mother sighed past time quickly, but since our argument, she has not easily allowed me to leave the house again. Whenever I wanted to go out, she would either say she was afraid something would happen to the baby or get angry saying that I was looking for a man. I did not understand why she had become so attached to that child when she had not even shown any attachment to me. Less than a month was left until my delivery, and my mother was packing suitcases saying that we would have a family vacation and that it would be good for us. This surprised me. It was time for me to give birth, and we went to the hospital. My mother was extremely anxious, and I did not understand why she was so worried. As I entered the delivery room, my mother disappeared. She left me alone and went somewhere, and I didn't know where. After giving birth, when I regained consciousness right there in the hospital room, there was mass chaos. I started to feel scared. My mother was still nowhere to be found, and no one was saying anything about the baby. Updates number 4. I asked the doctor what was happening and requested that they bring my baby to me. No one in the room, not even the staff, was saying a word or moving, and I started shouting, asking, "Where's my baby?" demanding they bring the baby now. The doctor gave me a medication to calm me down, and when I woke up a few hours later, they told me that my mother had taken the baby and fled. How did I not see it? How could anything good be expected from that woman? I started crying nonstop, overwhelmed by fear and horror. When I saw the police officers approaching the door of the room, I pleaded with them to find my baby. I was so weak that I felt like I was going to faint, but I could not lose my baby. All my hopes relied on finding my baby. It seemed like my mother thought the same as I did, but why was I always the one being abandoned? I told the police to arrest my mother and that I will be pressing charges against her, and I handed over all the evidence I've been holding on to for years. This time I would completely sever ties with my mom. I explained to the police that my mother had made vacation plans without informing me, claiming it was a surprise and that we would go as a family. My mother's family had never been my family. Now she was stealing my family. The police documented the statement, collected evidence, and launched a search. Well, they were found within a few days. I finally got my baby back, but I was filled with so much dread, anxiety, and mixed emotions that I could not be truly happy. My mother was prosecuted in court to the full degree. Her previous complaint against me, along with her stay at the clinic, proved to be significant disadvantage for her. After weeks and weeks, the judge's decision was announced. 5 years of imprisonment plus mandatory psychiatric treatment, and I completely removed my mother from my life and never went to see her again. Due to my mother, my baby had become seriously ill, so the baby had to stay some time in the hospital. Thank you for listening to my story. Alright guys, so this one has some very interesting points in the comment section. There was some people defending OP's mother, but there was also people just absolutely ripping her to shreds. I've never seen so many arguments in the comment section in my life. Okay, so it was basically saying OP's mother is the way that she is because she went through so much trauma and abuse from all these husbands who would lay their hands on her, verbally disrupt her, disrupt the household, and even put their hands on OP. Well, that trickled down and made her a bad person and started treating OP poorly and could have led to so many mental illnesses. So yeah, there's that perspective. And then there's another perspective where the people are saying it doesn't matter what trauma you went through. You cannot treat OP like that. I mean, that's your own kid. And not only that, you go and steal her baby? I mean, this story was just so wild. It had so much going on. I want to hear from you guys, though. Which side are you on, or do you think basically everyone kinda sucks here? Not really talking about OP, but everyone else in the story, between the two husbands, the mother. Let me know your perspective. Guys, drop it down below. Thank you for joining me on today's video. This was definitely a wild one. If you guys want more daily videos, the best way to get them is simple. And it helps support the channel so much, and it's free. All you gotta do is subscribe. Hit those bell notification icons. I'll catch you guys tomorrow, and just remember, it's cool to be kind. See ya.